Unlocking the Bible Omnibus by David Pawson. Numbers. Introduction. Numbers is not a well-known book, neither is it widely quoted. Perhaps only 2 verses are well known. Samuel Morse quoted one of these after he sent the first telegraph message in Morse code to Washington, D.C. on the 24th of May, 1844. He expressed his amazement at what had happened with the verse, "What have God wrought?" Translated in the NIV as, "See what God has done." The discovery of electronic communications was attributed to the God who had given the power. The second verse is known by most people. "Be sure your sin will find you out." This was originally said by Moses as a warning to the people when he was telling them that they must cross the Jordan and fight their enemies. Neither verse is generally known to come from Numbers. Very few people are able to quote verses from the book, and I have found that few know what any one chapter contains. We need to remedy this situation, as Numbers is another very important part of the Bible. Numbers is a strange title for a book. In the Hebrew, the title is taken from the first words of the scroll, "The Lord said." When the Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek, the translators gave it a new title, Arithmois, from which we get the word arithmetic. The Latin Vulgate version translated this as numeri, so in English we know it as Numbers. It begins and ends with 2 censuses. The first was taken when Israel left Sinai, 1 month after the tabernacle had been erected. The total number of people counted was 603,550. The second was taken when they arrived at Moab, prior to entering the land of Canaan, almost 40 years later. The number of people had dropped by 1,820 to 601,730. Not a very great difference. These were male censuses, used for military conscription. The Book of Numbers tells us that there is nothing wrong with counting. King David was punished by God for counting his men, but this was because he was motivated by pride. Other parts of the Bible include examples of counting and taking stock. We are told, for example, that 3,000 were added to the church at Pentecost. Jesus encouraged his followers to count the cost of following him by reflecting on how the leader of an army might evaluate his chances according to the relative strength of his army. 3 things can be said about the figures given in Numbers. Number 1. What a large number! Many Bible commentators question the size of the numbers. The figures actually represent the military conscription, the men over 20 years old who were able to fight. We have seen already in our studies of Exodus that there were over 2 million people in total, so the large number of 603,550 is actually a fraction of the whole population. There are a number of points to consider which indicate that the numbers given are in fact feasible and reasonable. In 2 Samuel we are told David's army was 1,300,000, so a figure of around 600,000 is small in comparison. The number is also small in comparison to the Canaanites. The Israelites would need to be of a certain strength in order to fight battles, remembering nevertheless that God was on their side. Those who argue that it is impossible for the 70 families who came to Egypt to produce so many forget that the people were in Egypt for 400 years. If each generation had 4 children, a small figure for those times, figure is possible. Some say it is too great a number to fit into the wilderness of Sinai. It is feasible, however. There was enough space. If they travelled 5 abreast, the column would be 110 miles long, and it would take 10 days to pass. Some say these numbers mean that there were too many people to be fed successfully in the wilderness. That would certainly have been the case for God's supernatural provision. Number 2. What's a similar number? Given the magnitudes involved, the difference of 1,820 between the first and second censuses represents a very small percentage change. The tribe of Simeon had lost 37,100 and Manasseh had gained 20,500, but most remained about the same. Since numerical growth indicates God's blessing, we can note from the outset this was not a period when God was pleased with his people. Considering the hostile environment and the length of time, however, maintaining such numbers was remarkable. Number 3. What a different number. There were over 38 years between the two censuses, so a whole generation perished in the wilderness. It was rare for men to reach 60. Moses was an exception to live until 120. So although that number was similar, the people were not. Only Joshua and Caleb, 2 out of 2 million, survived from those who left Egypt to enter the Promised Land. In some ways, this is the biggest tragedy in the whole Bible. Numbers is a very sad book. 2/3 of the book need never have been written. It should have taken 11 days to travel from Egypt to the Promised Land, but it actually took them 13,780 days. Only 2 of those who set out actually reached their home. The rest was stuck in an aimless existence, killing time until God's judgment was complete. Over time they all died in the wilderness, and a new generation took up the journey. Most lessons we learn from Numbers are negative. This is how not to be the people of God. Paul tells us how we should view it in 1 Corinthians 10. Now these things occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on things as they did. These things happened to them as examples and were written down as warnings for us, on whom the fulfillment of the ages has come. Numbers is full of bad examples. Context. What then is the context for this book? The journey from Mount Sinai to Kadesh Barnea, the last oasis in the Negev desert, and the beginning of the promised land of Canaan takes 11 days on foot. The route the Israelites took was to turn away from Kadesh and go across the Rift Valley to the mountains of Edom. They finished up in Moab on the wrong side of the River Jordan. It took 38 years and a few months, not because it was a particularly difficult piece of country, but because God only moved a little at a time. He stayed a very long time in each place and told them he would wait until every man among them was dead except Joshua and Caleb. What happened to bring God's judgment down on the people? At Kadesh, people refused to enter the land when God told them to. Today, many Christians have been brought out of sin, but have not enjoyed the blessing that God has set out for them. They too end up in a miserable wilderness. 2/3 of the book of Numbers is about this protracted journey. The Bible is a very honest book, telling us about failures and vices, as well as great successes and virtues. When Paul told the Corinthians that Numbers was written down as example and a warning to us, he meant this as a clear statement of purpose. It may not be a popular book, but if you do not study history, you are condemned to repeat it. Even Moses was not permitted to go into the Promised Land, although he did enter it centuries later when he talked with Jesus. He too failed miserably at one crucial point, as we shall see. Content and structure. Another of the 5 books of Moses, Numbers is a mixture of legislation and narrative. The author of the laws is not Moses, but God. We are told 80 times in this book, God said to Moses. God gives to Moses general laws and legislation, as well as regulations governing rituals and religious ceremony. As for the narrative in the book, we are told that Moses kept a journal of their travels at the Lord's command. He also kept another book called the Book of the Wars of the Lord, recording accounts of the battles. Numbers was written by Moses using these records, yet Moses himself is referred to in the third person. The mixture of narrative and legislation makes it seem rather like Exodus. Whereas in Exodus the first half is narrative and the second half law, in Numbers it is all mixed up. It is therefore much harder to find a connecting thread. A pattern emerges more easily when we consider the narrative and legislation in context. The structure of the book is chronological rather than topical. We can see this best by putting the content of Numbers alongside that of Exodus, Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Chronological context. Exodus 1 to 18, Egypt to Sinai. Content narrative, duration 50 days. Exodus 19 to 40 at Sinai, legislation is the content, and don't know the duration. Leviticus 1 to 27 at Sinai, the content legislation, the duration 30 days. Numbers chapters 1 verse 1 to chapter 10 verse 10 at Sinai, the content legislation, duration 19 days. Numbers chapter 10 verse 11 to chapter 12 verse 16 show Sinai to Kadesh, the contents are narrative, and the duration 11 days. Numbers chapter 13 verse 1 to chapter 20 verse 21, Kadesh, the contents legislation, and it doesn't say how many days. Numbers chapter 20 verse 22 to chapter 21 verse 35 is from Kadesh to Moab, where the contents narrative and duration 38 years. And Numbers 22 verse 1 to 36 verse 13 is Moab, where the contents legislation and duration 3 months and 10 days. And Deuteronomy 1 to 34, Moab, shows the context of legislation of the duration of 5 months. It is fascinating to note that all the laws were given to the Israelites while they were camped. The stories of their travels show how they broke those laws. While they were camped and stationary, God told them what they should do. While they were moving, we hear the story of what they did do. They would learn lessons both ways, through the teaching from Moses and through the experience of journeying, rather as Jesus taught his disciples both in messages, such as the Sermon on the Mount, and as they travelled along the way. The chart given is like a multi-layered sandwich. As in Exodus 1 to 11 the Israelites are stuck in Egypt. Then in chapters 12 to 18 they move to Sinai. All this is narrative. However, in Exodus 19 to 40, Leviticus 1 to 27, and Numbers 1 to 10, they are still at Sinai. These 3 consecutive sections are full of legislation. In Numbers chapter 10 to 12, they move again from Sinai to Kadesh, a journey of 11 days. They stay in Kadesh, which covers the crisis when the people rebel. God speaks to them at Kadesh from chapters 13 to 20, again with legislation. Numbers 20 to 21 covers a journey from Kadesh to Moab, the whole journey of 38 years, covering just 2 chapters. Numbers 22 to 36 covers what God said to the Israelites while they waited to go into the Promised Land. The whole of Deuteronomy 1 to 34 belongs to that stationary time period. Numbers has a lot of movement in it. Deuteronomy has none, and Exodus has movement in just the first half. Legislation. As noted above, we are told on 80 occasions in Numbers God spoke to Moses face to face. This was unique. Others would receive God's word through visions when they were awake, or dreams when they were asleep. The people would consult the priest's Urim, the equivalent of drawing lots, when they wished to discern God's mind on a situation. Moses first met with God on Mount Sinai, some distance from the rest of Israel, but now that the tabernacle was constructed, God was dwelling with the people. The big danger now that God was with them, however, was that they might become over-familiar, lose their sense of awe and respect, and forget His holiness. The laws in Numbers are not moral or social laws, but laws given to prevent the people from losing their reverence for God. The laws can be classified under 3 headings: carefulness, cleanliness, and costliness. Number 1, carefulness. They had to be very careful to camp in the right place. Chapter 2. Each tribe was allotted a specific place in relation to the other tribes, and the tabernacle in the centre. The camp looked like a hollow rectangle from above. The only other nation known to camp in this manner were the Egyptians. This was the preferred arrangement of Ramesses II, the pharaoh who may have been on the throne at the time. The tabernacle in the centre was surrounded by a fence, and there was only one entrance. 2 people camped outside the entrance, Moses and Aaron. The Levites camped around the other 3 sides, and 3 of their clans had special responsibility: Merari, Gershon, and Kohath. No one else could even touch the fence, and there were orders to kill anyone who approached. God was holy and could not be approached lightly. The other tribes were arranged around the tabernacle, each tribe with its own specific allotted place in relation to God's tent and the entrance to it. The most important place was right in front of the entrance, and this was occupied by the tribe of Judah. It was from the tribe of Judah that Jesus would later come. When trekking. When the camp set out on a journey, everyone moved according to a fascinating pattern. There were specific instructions for the dismantling and transporting of the tabernacle. The priests would wrap up the holy furniture, then the Levites would pick it up. Everyone knew who had to carry which piece of furniture from the tabernacle, who had to carry the curtains, and what order they had to be carried in. Some tribes had to leave before the tabernacle pieces were carried. When the other tribes moved, they unpeeled like an orange. They marched in the same order every time, so that when they got to the next camp it was simple for each tribe to find their place and put their tents up. The whole thing is carefully detailed. The silver trumpets would sound to announce a departure from the camp, and the tribe of Judah would lead the procession with praise. They always knew when it was time to move, because a pillar of cloud or fire at night above the tabernacle would move on. The picture is clear. When God moves, His people move. Why is God so fussy about all these details? Not only was it a very efficient way to move such a vast quantity of people, but it was also a very efficient way of camping. He was saying, be careful. A careless attitude does not have a place in God's camp. Carelessness is a dangerous thing. A modern word for this would be casualness, the any old thing will do for God attitude. In these detailed directions, God is telling his people to be careful, for he is in the camp with them. He also outlines other areas where they would need to be careful. There are some sins mentioned in Numbers which are sins of carelessness. Carelessness on the Sabbath was punishable by death. They were to have tassels on their clothes to remind them to pray. Vows had to be taken very seriously. If a vow was made to God, it must be kept. In Judges, we have the story of a man who vowed to sacrifice to God the first living thing that he met when he came out, and he met his daughter. If a wife makes a vow to God, then her husband has 24 hours to agree or disagree with it. Number 2, cleanliness. As well as being carefully arranged, the camp had to be spotlessly clean, for these were God's people. Even such things as the sewage arrangements were carefully detailed. They were told to take a spade when emptying their bowels, so that they could keep the camp clean for the Lord. He was not just concerned with germs. God was interested in a clean camp, because he is a clean God. The principle still holds today. A dirty, uncared-for church building is an insult to God. Not only was the camp to be clean, we are also told of the cleansing of the people before they left Sinai. There are further details of purification rites in chapter 19. Death is an unclean thing. God is a God of life, so there was to be no taint of death in the camp. There was even a jealousy test for adulterous wives. Even if there were no witnesses, God sees what happens and will punish the evildoer. This is his camp. The expression, cleanliness is next to godliness, has some considerable support from the book of Numbers. Number 3, costliness. Sacrifices and offerings. It is costly for a sinful person to live close to a holy God. Sacrifices were offered on behalf of the people on a daily, weekly and monthly basis. There were literally hundreds. Each sacrifice had to be costly. Only the best animals were offered. The daily sacrifice, weekly sacrifice and a special monthly sacrifice made it clear it was a costly matter to receive forgiveness from God. Blood had to be shed. Priesthood. Furthermore, the priesthood had to be supported by means of offerings. The Levites were consecrated for service before they left Sinai. Some 8,580 served, out of the 22,000 in the tribe, and both priests and Levites were dependent on the other tribes for their financial support. The upkeep of the priesthood, plus the regular sacrifices, therefore made up a considerable cost for the people. This teaches us that we still need to be very careful today about how we approach God. I may not need to bring a ram, pigeon or dove to be sacrificed when I come to God, but that does not mean I do not have to bring a sacrifice at all. There is as much sacrifice in the New Testament as in the Old. We read of the sacrifice of praise and the sacrifice of thanksgiving, for example. We need to ask ourselves whether we do make sacrifices to God. We too should prepare for worship. Numbers also tells us about the Nazirite vow, a voluntary vow of dedication and devotion to God, although not part of the priesthood. The Nazirites vowed not to cut their hair, nor to touch alcohol. Both were contrary to the social custom of the day, and not to touch a dead body. Some of these vows were temporary, others were for life. Samuel and Samson are the best known Nazarites in Scripture. By the time of Amos, the practice was ridiculed. What can we learn from this? Today there is a tendency towards an anti-ritual, casual approach to worship, forgetting that God is exactly the same today as he was then. We too are to approach him with awe and dignity. Hebrews reminds us that he is a consuming fire. In the New Testament we read of how those gathered for worship may bring a song, a word, a prophecy, a tongue, an interpretation. This is a New Testament equivalent, approaching God in the right frame of mind. Numbers also reminds us that we must worship God according to his taste and not ours. Modern worship tends to focus on the preferences of individuals, whether this be in favour of hymns or choruses, for example. We can forget that our preferences are quite irrelevant compared to the importance of making sure that our worship matches what God wants. Our sacrifices of praise and giving are also mentioned in the New Testament. They are a fragrant offering, an acceptable sacrifice pleasing to God, which was referring to their gift. In Leviticus and Numbers, God loved the smell of roast lamb. In the same way, our sacrifice of praise can be pleasing to God today. It's the attitude of the heart that counts to God. Narrative. In turning to the narrative parts of Numbers, we move from the divine word to human deeds, from what the people should do to what they did do. It is a sad and sordid story. The wilderness becomes a testing ground for them. They are out of Egypt but not in the promised land, and this limbo existence is very hard for them to endure. We need to remember that the people are now in a covenant relationship with God. He has bound himself to them. He will bless their obedience and punish their disobedience. The same acts of sin are committed in Exodus 16 to 19, as in Numbers 10 to 14. But only in Numbers is the law violated, so only in Numbers do the sanctions apply. God's law can help you see what is right and wrong, but it cannot help you do what is right. The law did not change their behaviour. It brought guilt, condemnation and punishment. This is why the law given on the first Pentecost day was inadequate and later needed the Spirit to be given on that same day. Without supernatural help, we would never be able to keep the law. Leaders. We will look first at the leaders of the nation and see how they tried and failed to live up to the laws. They are all from one family, 2 brothers and a sister. Moses, Aaron and Miriam, Hebrew version of the name Mary. We are told their good points and their strengths of character as well as their weaknesses. Strength. Moses. Moses is a dominant figure throughout the book. In many respects he was a prophet, a priest and a king. We have seen already how other prophets were given visions and dreams. Moses spoke face to face with God in the tabernacle. He was even allowed to see a part of God. He saw his back. He also acted in the role of priest. There are 5 occasions when he interceded with God. Indeed, on occasions he was quite bold in the way he prayed for the people and urged God to be true to himself. He was never called king, and of course this was some centuries before the monarchy was established, but he led the people into battle and ruled over them, and so functioned as a king even if the title was not used. One of the most notable things about Moses was that when he was criticized, badly treated or betrayed, he never tried to defend himself. Writing about himself, he said he was the meekest of all the men on the earth, a hard thing to say if you want it to remain true. Of course, Moses was saying no more than Jesus when he said we should learn from him, for he was meek and humble. Moses the Lord defend him. Meekness is not weakness, but it does mean not trying to defend yourself. Aaron. Aaron was Moses' brother, assigned to Moses as his spokesman when Moses had to face the Pharaoh in Egypt. He too was a prophet. He was also designated to be a priest, chief priest. The Aaronic priesthood became the heart of the worship and ritual of the ancient people of God. Miriam. Miriam was Moses and Aaron's sister. She was known as a prophetess. She sang and danced with joy when the Egyptians were drowned in the sea. So we have Moses as prophet, priest, and king, Aaron as prophet and priest, and Miriam as prophetess. Note that the gifts are shared and that prophecy is a ministry for women as well as for men. Miriam's particular prophetic gift was expressed in song. There is a very direct link between prophecy and music. In later years, King David chose choir masters who were also prophets, and Ezekiel would often request music as a preparation for his prophesying. It seems that there is something about the right kind of music which releases the prophetic spirit. Despite their strengths and gifts, however, each of these leaders failed in some way. It is instructive for us to examine their failings in detail. Weaknesses. Miriam. Miriam's problem was jealousy. She desired honour for herself. She wanted to speak with God as Moses did. In addition, she was critical of his choice of wife. Miriam was punished with leprosy for 7 days until she repented. She was among those who died at Kadesh. Aaron. The next to drop out of the leadership picture was Aaron. Once again, his problem was jealousy and desire for honour. Miriam and Aaron were together in criticising Moses. Their excuse was that Moses had married someone of whom they did not approve. He married a Cushite woman who had come out of Egypt with them, and who was not even a Hebrew. God did not criticise him for doing that, Miriam and Aaron did. Aaron thus died at Mount Hor, a little further on from Kadesh, when he was over 100 years old. Soon after they expressed jealousy and desire for honour, both Aaron and Miriam died. Moses. Even Moses failed. He became very impatient with the people. The New Testament tells us that he put up with the people for 40 years in the wilderness. It was an amazing task for leadership to deal with over 2 million people who were always grumbling, complaining, and having arguments that needed to be settled. His big mistake came when he disobeyed God's instructions concerning the provision of water. Moses had provided water for the people by striking the rock with his rod. The limestone of the Sinai desert has the peculiar property of holding reservoirs of water within itself. There are huge reserves of water in the Sinai desert, but they are usually surrounded by a rock and contained within the rock. Moses has released those reservoirs of water just by touching the rock with his rod. On the second occasion, when they were short of water, God told Moses not to strike the rock, but just to speak to it. A word would be sufficient to release the water in the rock. Moses was so impatient with the people that he did not listen to God carefully, and he struck the rock twice. God told Moses that because he was disobedient, he would not put a foot in the promised land. This is a poignant reminder of how important it is for a leader to listen carefully to God. Moses died at Mount Nebo, in sight of the promised land, but unable to enter it. Numbers tells us that it is a big responsibility to lead God's people. It must be done correctly, and it must be done God's way. Individual. There were a number of individuals who let God down throughout the book of Numbers. The most outstanding was a man called Korah. We find Korah leading a rebellion because he was angry that the priesthood should be exclusively the right of Aaron and his family. Others joined him in this subversion, and soon there were 250 gathered together, challenging the authority of Moses and the priesthood of Aaron. The rebels said they could not believe that God had chosen Moses and Aaron, and were critical of their failure to lead the Israelites into the promised land. Then, with great drama, Moses told the people to keep away from all the rebels' tents. Fire came down from heaven, struck their tents and destroyed them all. Korah saw it coming and ran away with a few of his followers, but they were swallowed up on some mud flats. In the Sinai desert, there are mud flats which have a very hard crust, but are very soft underneath, like thin ice on a pond. They are like a treacherous swamp or quicksand. Despite all this, some of the psalms are written by the sons of Korah. This man's family did not follow him in his rebellion, and his children later became singers in the temple. We do not need to follow our parents when they do evil. Korah is mentioned in the book of Jude in the New Testament as a warning to Christians not to question God's appointments and become jealous. Moses then announced that they needed to test whether God had chosen him and his brother for these positions. He told the leaders of the 12 tribes to get hold of twigs from the scrub bushes in the desert. They were to lay these twigs in the holy place before the Lord all night. In the morning, Aaron's stick had blossomed with leaves, flowers and budding fruit. The other twigs were dead. From then on, they put Aaron's rod inside the Ark of the Covenant as God's proof that Aaron was his choice and not self-appointed. People. The people as a whole were problematic, as well as some individuals. Acts tells us that God endured their conduct for 40 years in the wilderness. Numbers says that the whole people failed except two out of more than 2 million, not a high proportion. The people had one general problem and failed on 3 occasions of particular note. Grumbling. The general problem with the people was grumbling. You need no talent to grumble. You need no brains to grumble. You need no character to grumble. You need no self-denial to set up the grumbling business. It is one of the easiest things in the world to do. The people thought that because God was in the tabernacle, he did not know what they said when they went to their own tents. What a big mistake. They grumbled about the lack of water. They grumbled about the monotonous food. It says they grumbled because they could not have garlic, onions, fish, cucumbers, melons and leeks as they had in Egypt. God heard their grumbling and responded accordingly. Soon he sent them quail to supplement their diet of manna, so many that they lay 1.5 meters thick, covering 12 square miles of ground. People went out to gather the quail, but while they were still eating the meat, God struck them with a severe plague because they had rejected him. Grumbling probably does more damage to the people of God than any other sin. Oasis of Kadesh. The first particular occasion for failure was when they arrived at the last oasis, 66 miles southwest of the Dead Sea, today called Ain Fudias in the Negev desert. They were told to send 12 spies, one from each tribe, spy out the land and return to tell the whole camp what it was like. They spent 40 days in the south around Hebron and also travelled up to the far north, and they found it a very fertile land. But the conclusion of their report was negative. They spread the rumour that the land would devour them. They would rather go back to Egypt. 2 of the spies, Joshua and Caleb, said that God was with them and there was nothing to fear. They agreed that the land was very fortified and that it was inhabited by much bigger people. We know from archaeology, the average height of the Hebrew slaves was quite small compared to the Canaanites. They agreed too that the walls around the cities provided an obstacle, but they argued that God had not brought them this far to leave them in the desert. They told the people that God would carry them on his shoulders, just as a small boy might feel like a giant on the shoulders of his father. The pessimistic arguments of the other 10 spies were more persuasive, however. The crowd actually wanted to stone Moses and Aaron for bringing them all this way. It had been just 3 months since they had left Egypt, so they were prepared to kill Moses and Aaron for bringing them out of slavery. They preferred to trust in what the 10 spies saw and said. They took the majority verdict, which in this case was contrary to God's intentions. The contrast in the 2 reports is remarkable. 10 men said they were not able to take the land, and that was that. Joshua and Caleb said, "We can't, but God can." This was not merely positive thinking, but a willingness to see the problems as opportunities for God. As a result of the faithless outlook of the majority, God swore that not one of that generation would ever get into the promised land, except Joshua and Caleb. We are told that he swore by himself, because there is no one else higher by whom he could swear. They had been spying out the land for 40 days, so God said that for every day they had spied out the land and come to the wrong conclusion, they would spend 1 year in the wilderness. He made the punishment fit the crime. This event becomes the hinge of the book of Numbers, just a third of the way through. Had they obeyed God, the rest of the events in the book would never have taken place. The Valley of Scorpions. The next time the people tested God and failed came after a magnificent victory over the Canaanite king of Arad. They made their way back down into the deep valley of Arava, also known as the Valley of the Scorpions. It is just below Mount Hor, and is well known for its scorpion and snake population. Once again the Israelites grumbled against God, returning to the theme of the poor diet, saying they would prefer to return to Egypt rather than remain in the desert. This time God punished them by sending snakes, so that many were bitten and died. Realizing their sins, they asked Moses to intercede for them. God did not stop the snakes. He sent a cure for the snake bite. Moses set up a copper snake on a pole on the top of the mountain looking over the valley. If anyone was bitten by a snake, they could look at the copper snake on the pole and would not die. All they needed was faith to believe it would work. Plain of Moab. The third and final crisis came when they got to the plains of Moab. They achieved a number of victories along the way. They wanted to use a main route through Edom. Their request was denied, despite the historical link. Edom was descended from Esau, Jacob's brother. A battle ensued, and God gave them victory over Edom and Moab, so they were feeling confident. They camped by the Jordan, looking across to the promised land. There was opposition to their advance on Canaan. People of Ammon and Moab, owning land bordering the promised land, decided to disrupt their plans and hired a soothsayer from Syria to achieve their aim. This soothsayer from Damascus was named Balaam. He had built a reputation for seeing the defeats of the army. He had cursed. He had never been asked to curse Israel, whereas he actually explained to those who hired him, who could only say what God gave him to say. It was customary for a soothsayer to curse the opposition prior to a battle, and so Balaam was asked to pronounce ill words upon the Israelites. His motive was purely the fee he would be paid. However, he proved to be unable to utter curses against Israel and ended up blessing her instead. He was unable to help himself. Balaam announces that God will bless and multiply Israel, a prediction about King David and the son of David. We have an amazing account of a non-believer prophesying a blessing upon Israel. The account also tells the extraordinary story of the talking ass, who refuses to advance when he sees an angel in his path. After Balaam beats the ass for refusing to move, The ass finally tells him why he's not moving. Those who question whether this took place forget that animals can be possessed by evil spirits and good spirits. The serpent in the Garden of Eden, and Jesus sending demons into the pigs, two biblical examples. The message is clear. The animal has more sense than Balaam. It is a sad story because of the sequel. Balaam finally realized how to obtain money from the kings of Ammon and Moab. He told them to forget about cursing, but instead to send some of their pretty girls into the camp to seduce the Israelites. As this was prohibited by the law, most of the illicit sex took place outside the camp. But one man, Zimri, had the affront to bring a girl to the very door of the tabernacle. Seeing this awful act, a man named Phinehas pinned the couple to the ground with a spear. Thereafter he was given a perpetual priesthood for himself and his family. He was the only man to defend God's house against what was happening in God's sight. The judgment may seem harsh, but remember that the Israelites were heading for the promised land. One of the worst features they would find there would be immorality. There were fertility goddesses, occult statues, and phallic symbols, and all kinds of licentious behaviour. They needed to realize that such things were abominations before God. What can we learn from Numbers? Numbers was written for the Jews in order that later generations might learn to fear God. It was therefore written for Christians too, so we might learn from their failures. We have seen already how Paul told the Corinthians that these events were recorded as examples, warning us not to live as the Israelites did. We can also fail to arrive, just as they did. The Bible is a mirror in which we see ourselves, according to James. We can live and die in the wilderness. We can look back on the pleasures of sin, but be unable to look forward to God's rest in the promised land. We can learn more about the character of God from Numbers, and the twin themes of kindness and sternness are taken up again at various times in the New Testament, in Romans, Hebrews, Jude, and 2 Peter. Jude also mentions both Korah and Balaam. Grumbling was a big problem in the early church, as it was in Israel. When people grumble and complain, it is called a bitter root, which can grow inside a fellowship and cause trouble. In the New Testament, we are reminded that we are names, not numbers. Even the hairs of our head are numbered. Our names are in the book of life, but there is also evidence our names can be erased. What Numbers says about God? In Numbers, we are told very clearly that there are two sides to God's character. The Apostle Paul draws them out when he says, "Consider then the kindness and sternness of God." Number 1. On the one hand, we see his provision of food, drink, clothes and shoes. We see God providing his people with protection from their enemies, greater than them in size and number. We see his preservation of the nation despite their sinfulness. And number 2, on the other hand, we see his justice. He is faithful to his covenant promises, punishing the people when they sin. This involves discipline and ultimately disinheritance if they refuse to go on and follow his will. We deal with the same God. He is holy, and we must fear him. What Numbers says about Jesus? Number 1. As Israel went through the wilderness, so Jesus spent 40 days in the wilderness being tempted. Number 2, John 3:16 is well known, but the verse before it, less so. As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. Number 3, John also asserts that Jesus is the manna, the bread from heaven. Number 4, astonishingly, the Apostle Paul speaks of the water being struck from the rock in the wilderness, suggesting that the rock was none other than Christ. Number 5. Hebrews says if the ashes of a heifer could bring forgiveness, how much more will the blood of Christ achieve the same thing? And number 6, perhaps the most amazing thing, is that Balaam, the false prophet, actually made a true prophecy about Jesus. I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star will come out of Jacob. A scepter will rise out of Israel. From that time on, even devout Jews looked for the star of the King to come, and that is what led the wise men to Bethlehem. Blessings of fellowship with God. Perhaps the best known verse in Numbers is 6:24. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace. This was the blessing that God gave Aaron to give to the people when they set off from camp on the next part of their journey. It has every mark of direct inspiration from God because it is mathematically perfect. Whenever God speaks, his language is mathematically perfect. In the Hebrew, there are 3 lines in the blessing. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace. In the Hebrew, there are 3 words in the first sentence, 5 in the second and 7 in the third. There are 15 letters in the first, 20 in the second and 25 in the third. There are 12 syllables in the first, 14 in the second and 16 in the third. If you take the word Lord out, you are left with 12 Hebrew words. We are left with the Lord and the 12 tribes of Israel. It is mathematically perfect. Even in English build-up, there is a kind of crescendo through the lines. Each line has 2 verbs, and the second expands the first. The blessing applies to Christians today to the 2 things, blessings, also grace, and peace. This is the Christian blessing given in the epistles in the New Testament. Grace and peace to you from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. We too can receive the blessings of fellowship with God that Israel enjoyed if we heed the lessons of Numbers.